Oh, I think a lot about how our lives as individuals and especially as a community of faith get woven into this remarkable tapestry that we don't really see as it's being woven. It's only when we look back that we really see how the whole pattern is shaped out. And today is no exception to that. Usually when I get asked to do a service, there's something in particular that I want to talk about. And because of that, I pick scripture readings that somehow tie into what I want to say. But that really wasn't the case for today's service. Reverend Cheryl asked me to fill in and gave me the date. And since I had nothing in particular that I wanted to say, I looked at the scriptures in the lectionary for this date to see if there was some inspiration there. And when I saw that reading for today, a light bulb kind of went off and the theme started to come clear in my mind. And then the past couple of weeks, Reverend Cheryl has been talking about community. And that leads into what I wanted to talk about this morning in a kind of a cool way. So let's see if I can't weave some sort of a lesson out of this. So here's the line in the reading that grabbed me. It's the line that says, "The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law." Not as the teachers of the law. In some Bible translations, it says scribes instead of teachers of the law. But regardless, it means in that day, professionals who were well educated for the times and powerful and had knowledge of the law and had teaching authority based on their knowledge of and adherence to tradition, especially the traditional interpretation of the sacred text. Every village had at least one scribe. But the scriptures makes a point of saying Jesus taught in his own way, not as the teachers of the law. He taught as one who had authority, personal mastery, or expertise in the subject matter. And to me, that's an important difference. And when I look backward, when I think about my own faith journey, a lot of the most influential moments in that journey were not because of teachers of the law. It was because I was inspired and led by people with personal and moral expertise. I'm not saying anything against our teachers of the law, heaven forbid. We have a pair of remarkable ministers here who do a great job. It's just that I feel that the support of this community of faith and the ones I've belonged to in the past play at least as important a role in the thread in my tapestry. And so this theme immediately brought to mind some stories from my past to illustrate that. You might know, I think some of you do, I started my apprenticeship when I was 17. I started on a Monday after finishing grade 12 on the Friday. My community of faith at the time was Kitchener Street United in Niagara Falls. And when our clerk of session found out that I was now a working guy, theoretically an adult, she started pushing me to take on more of an active role in the church and a leadership role. If I recall correctly, I held her off for as long as I could. But within a couple of years, I was actually on the board there. And within a few years after that, I began to serve as chair of the board. And I did that for a decade until we made the hard decision to close the church. But without Marg's urging, I'm not sure I would have taken on that role. And at least I wouldn't have taken on as soon as I did. So looking back, I'm really grateful for her pushing. Wasn't so much at the time. The other thing that I appreciate looking back on that same story is I had the same secretary of the board for that whole decade that I served there. Marianne and I led that team side by side through good times and some really awful times as things dwindled off before we closed. Without her strength beside me, there is no way I would have lasted in that role. So those were a couple of members of my faith community that were a huge influence in my early church life. Not teachers of the law, but people who spoke with authority in their own way. Another one of my early church influences when I look back he was actually a teacher of law. He was a minister. But what I remember most about Reverend Frank Mitchell was something he said to me that it wasn't part of his preaching, it wasn't part of his pastoral care, it was just in conversation. He mentioned in passing, he wondered if we were alone in the universe, and he wondered aloud what UFOs actually were. Just, it has nothing to do with church stuff, but he was looking forward to sitting at the Father's feet, learning about those things, and learning about everything else. For a young, nerdly type like me, that story really stuck. I've never forgotten it, and I guess for a guy who I recognize as being well-educated and such an amazing pastor, it meant a lot to me that he recognized how much he didn't know, and it meant even more when he talked about learning at the feet of the one who created it all. So my next story jumps a few years later, and it's really nothing to do with church life, but there's a story here nonetheless. This will be the only story you ever hear me tell where my dad is the negative side. So bear that in mind. My mom and dad, for years and years, had a motorhome. It was parked in their driveway one time, and Dad headed out in the morning to do some work on it. And as he was unlocking the door, a voice called out from inside the motorhome saying, "Don't freak out, man, I'm in here." He opened the door, and it turned out some homeless dude had found an unlatched window and had crawled in and had a really nice, comfy sleep in Dad's motorhome. So Dad obviously chased him off in no uncertain terms, but this is where the story takes a little bit of a turn. Mom heard the commotion out in the driveway, and when she came out and found what was going on, her first reaction was she was mad at Dad for yelling at this poor guy. And then she followed the guy down the road to give him a sandwich because she knew, being homeless, he would obviously be hungry. So looking back at the story, the point of it is, obviously the law was on Dad's side. He was chasing off somebody that had broken into one of his properties. But who was actually in the right? The one who followed the law, or the one who showed clear compassion for somebody in need? It's one of my favorite stories back from my parents. So the next story is I've touched on this one a little bit before, but I want to build on it a little bit. I know I've mentioned before how the death of a close friend, let's see if I can get through this. So the death of a close friend prompted me to do my first overseas habitat build in 2015. As I said earlier, I started my apprenticeship as a structural draftsman at 17. And about 9 years later, I moved into a contracts manager role at NIagara Structural Steel in St. Catharines. And one of the projects that I was handed to manage was a renovation at the de Havilland facility in Toronto. And I remember clearly at the launch meeting how our construction manager said that the ironworker foreman who was going to be on site was going to be a new guy that he'd been after for a while. He said Brian was a rising star in the steel industry. And Brian and I ended up forming from that start a friendship that lasted more than 25 years through 4 different employers. Even when he wasn't working on one of my projects, he'd call me once or twice a month on the phone to chat. Sometimes just to complain about the deplorable state of the Canadian steel industry, but often with a specific question about why something was drawn in a particular way. And in return, Brian taught me virtually everything I know about hanging iron. And for me, it was great to be able to actually teach him a little bit about my side of the industry. That teaching me about the ironworking trade wasn't part of his job. He wasn't required to teach me that, but it was a role he took to heart. After he passed away, when I went to the funeral home to express my condolences, I was astonished to see that the lineup went across the room and down the hall and out the door and around the building. So clearly, I was not the only one that felt a kinship to my friend Brian. Imagine drawing that kind of a community of mourners purely on the basis of having spent your career being willing and able to teach people about what you do and mentor them along the way. It's got nothing to do with church, really. But when I heard the line, he taught them as one who has authority, not as the teachers of the law, it reminded me of my friend. The next story is another case where I'm building on something I've mentioned before. I've told these stories probably endlessly about my habitat build in the Philippines, and especially the day that three of us, on our day off, went and wandered around the nearby community. And you may recall the story, how we were invited into a home there by a young lady who she was studying tourism in the Philippines and wanted to actually chat with some real actual tourists, and there we were. So we were called into the compound. She brought out chairs, sat and chatted with us in this little compound where the family had a business fabricating tuk-tuks. And it was a remarkable interaction. But wandering in a foreign community, chatting with the locals, is not something that I would normally consider to be within my comfort zone by a considerable margin. But my teammate Ken talked me into it. And the rest, as I say, is history. But that's not all of the story. Ken also led the first habitat build that I did on Indigenous territory in Canada. And we've collaborated on a number of builds since then. I've been on several of his teams, and he's been on both of the builds I led, and he'll be there again in June. And remarkably, a whole bunch of you from this community of faith have also met him. He came down to talk to our outreach team about the Four Seasons of Reconciliation education program a few years ago. So some of you met him then, and then a bunch of you joined me on last year's habitat build, and Ken was there, so you got to meet him there. So for somebody who's not a churchy type of guy, he has sure had an impact on this community of faith. Again, it reminds me of that line. He taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. But what an influence. One of the elders that Ken introduced me to at Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, where we will be heading in June, was an elder named Miptun Shigano. Some of you may actually meet him when we head up there in June this year. I'm trying to get him onto the site a couple of times. He was trained as a teacher, but two things that he taught us stand out for me from the time that we spent together. The first one is this: he took us for a walk in the woods, and he was talking about various plants and trees and the health of the forest and all of that kind of thing. But the lesson that resonated the most for me was he left us two at a time, a couple of 100 yards apart, to sit in silence in the woods. And in essence, absorb the glory of the Creator's creation. It is something that all of us should do from time to time, because it is a remarkable thing to sit and listen to that. The other thing he taught us, this is kind of cool. I was gonna ask Rick to help me show this, but I need somebody with short sleeves. Susan, can you just come up for a second? So Miptun has a different way of shaking hands, because he doesn't. The traditional handshake is to show that you are unarmed. That's the tradition. He prefers to do this on the wrist. And the reason for that is because in the wrist, the blood vessels and nerves are closest to the surface. And when you grip somebody there, you can feel the essence of that person. That's how he likes to shake hands. Thank you. That's not something you'll hear from the teachers of the law, but it is certainly something that somebody who speaks with the authority to teach that kind of thing is a remarkable experience. So last story for today. I could do this forever, but I'll have a heart attack if I do. So my last story for today feeds from that last one because it builds on my personal commitment to Indigenous matters and reconciliation. Back in late summer last year, I applied to join the United Church's Mission Support Work Group, which assesses grant applications from Indigenous communities of faith within the United Church, assesses their submittals and approves or denies them in accordance with the annual strategy and the budget afforded us. So my application had to go to the National Indigenous Council, and I'm rather proud to say that they thought my skill set would be helpful, and so they accepted my membership to the team. My point in telling that story is not just bragging that they thought I could be useful. The letter that they sent to the church council here, announcing my acceptance to that group, was worded really nice. I really liked the way this was done. And it stated really well how important the support of the whole community of faith is to people doing the work that our faith inspires. So I'm going to read most of the letter just because I love the way they worded this, and there's some important stuff in here. So this is the letter that came out of this. On behalf of Murray Pruden, Executive Minister for Indigenous Ministries and Justice, I am pleased to be able to inform you that John Bedell of St. John's Stevensville Pastoral Charge, I like the sound of that because it's not that long that I've actually been a member here, was appointed as a member to the Mission Support Working Group by the National Indigenous Council this fall. Those who serve faithfully through the National Indigenous Council are essential to living out the call of the United Church of Canada. Equally essential are all those who continue to guide, inspire, and support these members. For all the ways that you and the members of this community of faith have been a part of and will continue to be a part of John's leadership, we offer our thanks. So in making just a simple announcement, they found a way to tie it to the whole community, that all of this is important. Some of us doing this work recognize full well that without the support of the whole team, that simply wouldn't happen. So all of you who are not teachers of the law are absolutely essential in guiding and inspiring and supporting the rest of us. So those stories are they're a few of the steps in my journey that reminded me of the theme, a few threads that make up that tapestry. So I can't think of any better way than that to end this, other than to say, thank God for this little community of faith and all of you